Most Christians celebrate Easter every year without realizing something is wrong, because the name Easter itself is not found anywhere in the Bible. And once you see that, everything you thought you knew starts shifting. Every spring, pastel colors fill stores. Baskets overflow with chocolate eggs everywhere. Children run through yards searching for hidden eggs, laughing under bright skies. Families gather, traditions repeat, and it all feels warm, familiar, comforting inside. But somewhere beneath the surface, a quiet question begins to rise slowly. Is this really what the resurrection was meant to look like originally? You have probably seen those viral posts spreading across social media recently. Images of Jesus, empty tombs, captions declaring, "This is not about bunnies." And deep down, you understand the emotion behind those powerful words completely. Because something about modern Easter feels slightly disconnected from something sacred. Not wrong enough to notice instantly, but just enough to feel unsettled. And that feeling is where this conversation truly begins to take shape. Because what if the issue is not just the candy or decorations? What if the deeper issue is something much more foundational than traditions? Something so hidden, most people never even think to question it seriously. And the moment you start questioning it, everything begins to unfold differently. What you are about to hear might challenge everything you believed about Easter, because the word Easter does not appear in the Bible even once. And that single fact has quietly confused millions of believers for centuries. So the question becomes unavoidable once you start thinking about it seriously. How did the central event of Christianity receive a name outside Scripture? And more importantly, why has almost nobody stopped to question this before? If the resurrection is the foundation of the Christian faith itself today, then its name should logically come directly from the biblical text itself. But when you search from Genesis all the way to Revelation carefully, you will not find Easter written anywhere in the original biblical narrative. And that creates a gap most people have never been taught to notice. Because tradition often feels stronger than truth when repeated for generations consistently, but the moment you see that gap, you cannot unsee it anymore. It begins to pull you deeper into a question that demands real answers. Was this simply a harmless tradition shaped by culture over time slowly? Or is there a deeper story hidden beneath the surface of everything? A story that connects directly to the true meaning of the resurrection itself. And once you start asking that, the entire journey begins unfolding. Here is where the tension becomes impossible to ignore any longer. The resurrection is the most important event in the entire Bible story. It is the moment everything points toward and everything flows from eternally. Without it, the entire foundation of Christianity completely collapses into nothingness. And yet, the way we celebrate it today feels strangely disconnected. The name, the symbols, the traditions, they do not come from Scripture. They feel familiar, but they do not feel rooted in the original story. And that creates a quiet but powerful conflict inside many believers today. Because something sacred has been wrapped inside something culturally constructed over time. And most people never stop long enough to separate those two layers. They experience the celebration without ever questioning its deeper foundation honestly. But once you begin to notice the difference, it becomes impossible to ignore. Because now you are holding two realities that do not fully align. One comes from the Bible, the other comes from somewhere else entirely. And the deeper you think about it, the more the tension grows. How can the center of the faith feel so distant from its origin? How can something so sacred be surrounded by something not originally sacred? And that question, pulls you further into a search for the truth. This single Bible verse might explain the entire Easter confusion completely. In the King James Version Bible, Acts chapter 12, verse 4 reads something surprising. It says Herod intended after Easter to bring Peter before the people. And for many years, this looked like proof Easter was biblical originally. But here is where things begin to get deeply uncomfortable very quickly. Because the original Greek word in that verse was not Easter. The word used in the earliest manuscripts was actually Pascha instead. And Pascha is not a mysterious word hidden in ancient languages. It is the direct Greek form of the Hebrew word Pesach. And Pesach has one clear meaning that scholars fully agree on. It means Passover, not Easter, not even close in linguistic meaning. In fact, that same word appears 29 times in the New Testament, and in 28 of those cases, it is translated as Passover. Only one time, this single verse, it becomes the word Easter instead. And that raises a serious question that cannot be ignored anymore. Why would the same word be translated differently in just one place? Was it intentional, or was it simply a translation decision over time? Some argue Herod was waiting for a pagan festival separate from Passover, but most modern scholars reject that explanation based on textual consistency, because the surrounding context clearly places the timing during Passover events, which means the translation Easter likely does not reflect the original meaning. And modern Bible translations have quietly corrected this issue already today. Versions like NIV, ESV, and NKJV all consistently use the word Passover. So the foundation begins to shift as soon as you see this clearly. Because the only place Easter appears in Scripture may not be accurate. And if that is true, then something much bigger starts unfolding here. It suggests the resurrection was never originally framed around Easter itself. Instead, it was deeply connected to something far older and more precise. And that realization opens the door to a much deeper understanding. One translation decision may have reshaped how millions understand the resurrection today. Because the word Pascha appears 29 times across the New Testament text, and in 28 of those it is translated clearly as Passover. Only once, just once, it suddenly becomes the word Easter instead. And that single shift carries more weight than most people realize. Because language does not just describe meaning, it shapes understanding over time. When one word changes, the entire frame of the story can shift. And here, that shift moved the focus away from Passover entirely. Which means generations grew up connecting resurrection to a different concept, not the one rooted deeply in the original biblical narrative itself. And the more you think about that, the more unsettling it becomes. Because this was not a rare or obscure word in Scripture originally. Pascha was consistent, repeated, and clearly understood by early believers everywhere. It carried a specific meaning tied directly to a historical event, a moment of deliverance that defined identity for an entire people. So when that word changes even once, it creates a ripple effect. A ripple that slowly expands across centuries of belief and tradition. And most people never stop to trace that ripple back to its source. But once you do, you begin to see the pattern more clearly. This was not just about translation, it was about interpretation over time. About how meaning can drift when language is subtly adjusted without notice. And that raises an even deeper question beneath everything you have heard. If the original word always pointed to Passover so consistently before, Then why does the modern celebration feel so far removed from it? What happened between the early church and the world we see today? Because something shifted, not instantly, but gradually across generations, quietly. And that shift did not stop with language alone, as you will see. What if the name Easter actually came from something completely outside the Bible? Because history reveals a detail that most people have never seriously considered before. The English word Easter does not come from Hebrew or Greek roots. Instead, it traces back to a much older cultural and religious tradition. An 8th century monk named Bede recorded something very unusual in his writings. He described a pagan goddess named Eostra worshipped during early spring festivals. A goddess associated with fertility, renewal, and the changing of seasons. And her festival took place in the same time period as resurrection celebrations. For centuries, scholars questioned whether this goddess ever truly existed historically. Because Bede was the only ancient source mentioning her directly in detail. But that uncertainty did not last forever, as new discoveries emerged later. In 1958, archaeologists uncovered inscriptions in parts of Germany. More than 150 dedications to similar goddesses were discovered. Known as the Matronae Austriacenae, connected linguistically to Eostra traditions. And suddenly, Bede's account no longer seemed like a simple invention. It pointed to a real, localized belief system tied to spring celebrations. Which means something important likely happened as Christianity spread across Europe. The message of resurrection remained, but the surrounding culture influenced its expression. The old festival names did not disappear, they were simply reassigned meaning. And over time, the name Eostra evolved into the word Easter itself. But the influence did not stop with the name alone, as you might expect, because symbols from those older traditions quietly came along with it. Eggs, long seen as symbols of new life and fertility across cultures. Rabbits, known for reproduction, became connected to the same seasonal imagery. And while these symbols feel harmless or even fun in modern celebrations, they were never part of the original biblical narrative surrounding resurrection events. They are cultural echoes, fragments of a worldview that existed before Christianity. And over time, those fragments blended into what many now call Easter traditions. Which creates a powerful realization that cannot be easily ignored anymore. The name, the symbols, the atmosphere, they did not begin in Scripture. They developed through history as different beliefs intersected over many generations. And once you recognize that pattern, everything begins to look different. Because now the question becomes impossible to avoid any longer entirely. If all of this came from outside the biblical story originally, then what exactly did the Bible intend us to remember instead? This is the moment where everything you have heard finally comes together clearly. Because the truth is simpler and deeper than most people ever expected. Easter, as a name and tradition, is not rooted in Scripture originally, but the event it represents is absolutely central to the entire Bible. And that distinction changes how you see everything from this point forward. Because the Bible never built the resurrection around something called Easter. It built everything around something far older, far more precise, and intentional. It built it around Passover, the defining story of deliverance in Scripture. A story repeated, remembered, and reinforced across generations without interruption. A pattern designed long before the resurrection ever took place historically. And once you see that pattern, the connection becomes impossible to miss. Because the resurrection was never meant to stand isolated from that story. It was meant to complete it, fulfill it, and give it its ultimate meaning. So the issue is not whether people celebrate something meaningful today. The issue is whether they understand what that meaning was originally pointing toward. Because something can feel right emotionally and still miss its deeper truth. And that is where this realization begins to shift your entire perspective. It is not about rejecting everything you have known up to this point. It is about seeing the foundation beneath it more clearly than before. About recognizing that a name can change without changing the event itself, but understanding the original context reveals a depth many have never experienced. Because now the resurrection is no longer just a yearly tradition to remember. It becomes part of a continuous story unfolding across the entire Bible. A story that did not begin in the New Testament, suddenly or randomly, but one that was carefully built, layer by layer, across centuries of history. And once that realization settles in, something begins to shift internally. Because now you are not just asking what Easter means culturally today. You are asking what the Bible intended this moment to represent eternally. And that question leads directly into the heart of the original story. What if the resurrection story actually began thousands of years before Jesus arrived? Because to understand it fully, you have to go back to Egypt. Back to a night filled with fear, silence, and an approaching judgment. The people of Israel had lived in slavery for 400 years, generations born into bondage, waiting for something they could not control. And then God spoke, not with comfort, but with a final warning. A plague was coming, the death of every firstborn in Egypt. But in the middle of that terrifying moment, a way of escape appeared. Each family was commanded to take a lamb, perfect and without blemish, to sacrifice it and spread its blood across the door of their home. Not as a symbol only, but as a mark of protection that night. Because when death passed through the land, it would see the blood. And when it saw that blood, it would pass over that house. That is where the name comes from, the Passover itself. A moment when judgment came, but mercy made a way through sacrifice. And this was not just a one-time event in history. God commanded them to remember it every single year without fail. Year after year, the same story repeated through the same ritual. A lamb sacrificed, a meal shared, a deliverance remembered together again. And over time, it became more than memory. It became identity. A nation defined by the moment they were rescued from death itself. But here is where the story begins to take on deeper meaning. Because this was never only about Egypt or physical slavery alone. It was a pattern, something pointing forward beyond its original moment. A living prophecy repeated across generations without them fully seeing it. And every time a lamb was sacrificed, it told the same story. That deliverance comes through sacrifice, and life comes through substitution. And for over 1,500 years, this pattern never truly changed, until one specific Passover in Jerusalem altered everything forever, completely. What if Jesus was not just part of Passover, but the fulfillment itself? Because everything that happened next was not random, it was perfectly timed. As Passover approached, Jesus gathered with his disciples for one final meal. And this was not an ordinary dinner. It was the Passover celebration, the same ritual practiced for over 1,000 years by every generation. Bread without yeast, wine in a cup, symbols carried through centuries faithfully. But in that moment, something unexpected began to unfold before their eyes. Jesus took the bread, broke it, and gave it a new meaning. He said, "This is my body, given for you in sacrifice." Then he took the cup and redefined it in the same way. "This is my blood, poured out for many. A new covenant begins." And in that moment, the entire meaning of Passover started shifting. Because he was no longer just remembering the story, he was becoming it. The lamb was no longer on the table, the lamb was sitting there. And within hours, that reality would become impossible to ignore completely. Because outside the city, events were already moving toward their climax. According to the Gospel of John, something remarkable about the timing appears. Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation for Passover itself. At the exact moment lambs were being sacrificed in the temple courts. Thousands of lambs, their blood pointing to something greater than themselves. And at that same moment, Jesus was hanging on a cross nearby. Not as coincidence, but as the fulfillment of everything they represented. Because those lambs could only point forward, they could never complete it. But Jesus did not just point to deliverance. He became deliverance itself. This is why the Apostle Paul later writes with complete clarity, "Christ, our Passover Lamb, has been sacrificed once and for all." Not as poetry, not as symbolism, but as a precise theological statement. Because everything in Passover was always leading to this exact moment. The blood, the sacrifice, the deliverance, all of it converged here. And once you see that connection, it becomes impossible to separate them. Because Jesus did not just die during Passover, he died as Passover. What if the resurrection was not just a miracle, but a precise fulfillment? Because what happened next follows a pattern most people have never noticed. After Passover came another feast, one often overlooked but deeply significant. It was called First Fruits, the offering of the first harvest to God. A sheaf of grain lifted up as a promise of what was coming. Not the full harvest yet, but the guarantee that it would arrive. And this moment carried meaning far beyond agriculture or seasonal cycles. It represented hope, assurance, and the beginning of something much greater. Now here is where the connection becomes almost impossible to ignore. Jesus rose from the dead on the very day of first fruits itself. Not randomly, not approximately, but exactly within that prophetic timing. And that detail changes how you see the resurrection completely. Because it was not just life returning after death in isolation. It was the first sign of a greater resurrection still to come. This is why Paul writes with such intentional and careful language. Christ has been raised as the firstfruits of those who sleep. Meaning his resurrection is not the end, it is the beginning. A guarantee that death will not have the final word forever. Just as the first harvest promises the fullness still ahead later, so his rising promises life for all who follow after him. And suddenly, the story expands beyond a single empty tomb moment. It becomes a pattern of death, life, and future restoration unfolding. Because the timing was never accidental or loosely connected at all. It was a design, a structure woven into history long before. Passover, sacrifice, then first fruits, resurrection, all perfectly aligned together. And once you see that structure, everything starts connecting deeply. Because now, the resurrection is not just something that happened once. It becomes part of a larger story still unfolding even today. A story pointing forward, just as it always has from beginning. And that realization naturally leads to what happened next historically. What happened next in history quietly changed how millions understand the resurrection today. Because the shift did not happen instantly, it unfolded slowly over generations. As Christianity spread across the Roman world, new questions began to emerge. How should believers celebrate the resurrection? And when should it be observed? Some followed the original timing connected directly to Passover every year. Others believed it should always be celebrated on a Sunday instead. And that disagreement grew into a serious division within the early church. It became known as the Quartodeciman controversy among early Christian communities. A debate not just about dates, but about identity and direction itself. Should the celebration remain tied to its biblical roots in Passover tradition? Or should it become something distinct, separate from its Jewish foundation? And that question eventually reached a turning point in history itself. In 325 AD, leaders gathered at the First Council of Nicaea to decide. A decision was made that would shape Christian practice for centuries ahead. The resurrection would no longer be tied directly to the Passover calendar. Instead, it would always be celebrated on a Sunday moving forward. Calculated by the first full moon after the spring equinox period. And with that decision, something subtle but significant began to change. The original connection to Passover started fading quietly over time, not erased completely, but gradually becoming less central to the celebration. And as that connection weakened, space opened for other influences to enter. Cultural traditions, regional customs, and local beliefs began filling that space. The focus shifted from biblical timing to a more universal festival structure. And over centuries, that shift became normalized across entire Christian cultures. Most people never realized how that transition originally took place historically, because by the time it reached them, it felt completely natural already. But when you trace it back, the turning point becomes unmistakably clear. The celebration remained, but its anchor had quietly been moved elsewhere. And once that anchor shifted, everything built on it began shifting too. Which brings us to what that shift ultimately means for us today. What if the resurrection is not just personal, but cosmic in its meaning? Because when you step back, the story expands far beyond one moment. From Egypt to the cross, a pattern of deliverance keeps repeating clearly. God rescues people, not just from situations, but from deeper realities. The Passover was not only about leaving slavery in a physical sense. It was about God breaking the power of something holding people captive. And that same pattern reaches its full meaning in the resurrection itself. Because this time, the enemy is not Egypt, but sin and death. Not a single nation, but all humanity across every generation alive. And the deliverance is not temporary, it is eternal and complete. Which means the resurrection is not just about Jesus rising alone. It is about a new reality breaking into the world permanently. A new creation beginning where death no longer defines the outcome. Just as Genesis describes life emerging from chaos at the beginning, now life emerges again, this time from a sealed and silent tomb. And that connection changes how you see the entire biblical story, because it is no longer separate events scattered across different books. It becomes one unified narrative moving toward a single destination. A story where every promise finds its fulfillment in one moment, where every shadow gives way to something real and lasting forever. And suddenly, the resurrection is not just something to remember yearly. It becomes something that defines how reality itself is being reshaped. Because if death has been overcome once, it can be overcome fully. If life has broken through once, it will break through again. And that realization carries a weight far beyond simple belief systems. It invites you into a story that is still unfolding right now. A story where the outcome has already been secured in advance. And the implications reach further than most people ever imagine, which naturally leads to a simple way to understand it clearly. What if everything you believed was true, but framed in the wrong context? Imagine finding a photo of someone you deeply love and respect. You keep it safe, but place it inside a cheap plastic frame. The colors are bright, distracting, and not connected to the person. Over time, you stop noticing the frame and only see the image, because it has always been presented to you in that exact way. And nothing feels wrong until someone points it out clearly. They tell you the person in that photo made a different frame, a handcrafted one, carved carefully with meaning and personal history, a frame built from something connected to their actual life story. And that frame has been sitting unseen, forgotten, and rarely considered. So you go looking, and eventually you find it waiting quietly. Simple, not flashy, but filled with details that carry deeper meaning. Every line, every mark, connected directly to the person you remember. And when you place the photo inside that original frame finally, something shifts. Even though the image itself has not changed, you begin to see it differently, more clearly, more completely than before. Because now it is surrounded by the context it was meant for, and the distractions that once felt normal start to fade away. They are not evil, just incomplete compared to what you discovered. And that is what happens when you see the resurrection this way. The event itself has never changed across time or generations, but the frame around it has slowly shifted over many years. A cultural frame, colorful, familiar, but not originally part of it. And when you replace that frame with the original biblical context, the meaning does not shrink, it expands beyond what you expected. Because now you see the full story, not just a single moment. You see where it came from and where it is leading next. And that clarity naturally changes what matters most in the end. What if the real question was never about the name we use today, because the power was never in the word Easter to begin with, and it was never in the symbols that surrounded it over time? The power has always been in the event that changed everything. The moment death was confronted and life broke through completely. And that moment does not depend on language, culture, or tradition. It stands on its own, anchored in something far deeper than that. But understanding its original context changes how you experience it. Because now you are not just remembering a single day each year. You are stepping into a story that stretches across all of Scripture. From the first Passover in Egypt to the empty tomb in Jerusalem, a continuous thread connecting sacrifice, deliverance, and new life together. And that connection grounds your faith in something much more solid. Not a tradition passed down, but a promise fulfilled across history. Because what God began, He completed exactly as it was intended. And the resurrection becomes the confirmation of that entire plan. Which means it is not just something to celebrate occasionally anymore. It becomes something that shapes how you see everything moving forward, how you understand life, death, and the hope beyond both completely. Because now the focus shifts away from what surrounds the event and returns to what the event itself was always meant to reveal. A lamb given, a sacrifice made, a victory secured once forever. And that is where the story finds its true center of gravity, not in the name, but in the meaning behind it eternally. And once that becomes clear, one final response begins to emerge. If this truth surprised you, there are millions who still have never heard it. Because most people celebrate Easter every year without questioning its origin deeply. They follow tradition, repeat patterns, and never stop to ask why exactly. And that is why conversations like this matter more than ever today. Because understanding the truth changes not just knowledge, but perspective entirely. It reshapes how you see faith, history, and the story itself unfolding. And if this helped connect something for you that never made sense, then it is very likely someone else needs to hear this too. Someone who feels the same tension but cannot explain it clearly. Someone who senses something is missing but cannot define what exactly. And sometimes one shared video can open that door for them. So if this gave you clarity, consider passing it along intentionally, not as an argument, but as an invitation to explore deeper truth. Because the goal is not to win debates, but to reveal meaning. And that meaning becomes clearer the more people engage with it. If you have never thought about this before, take a moment. Let it settle, reflect on it, and consider what it really means. Because this is not just information, it is a shift in understanding. And those shifts often take time to fully process and absorb. But they can change everything once they begin to take root. If you found value here, you can support by subscribing today. Because content like this continues reaching more people through engagement signals. Even a simple comment helps this message spread further organically. You do not need to write something long or complicated at all. Even one word can make a difference in how far it goes. Because the algorithm responds to interaction more than most realize, and your action could help someone else discover this perspective soon. Most people will never question what they have always been taught, unless something interrupts that pattern and invites them to think deeper. And maybe this video is that interruption for someone you know. So if this made you pause, think, or see things differently, take that next step and help this message reach someone else. Because the story we explored here is not just worth hearing, it is worth understanding, remembering, and sharing with intention moving forward. And as more people rediscover that original meaning behind everything, the focus slowly shifts back to what truly matters most. Not the name, not the symbols, but the story itself. A story of sacrifice, deliverance, and life that overcomes death forever. And that story does not need anything added to give it power. It already carries more meaning than most people ever realize. So wherever you are watching this from today, take it with you. Think about it, revisit it, and let it shape how you see things. Because sometimes the smallest realization leads to the biggest transformation later. And this might be one of those moments for you personally.